My name is Annalise Meyer, and for 68 years, I have curated a life of quiet intention. It is a life measured not in grand achievements, but in the steady rhythm of seasons viewed from my porch swing, in the scent of rain on the dusty soil of my garden, and in the weight of a well-loved book in my hands. I was a librarian for 4 decades in our small town of Havenwood, a community nestled in the soft, rolling foothills where the mountains begin their slow climb towards the sky. My cottage, with its climbing roses and slightly crooked shutters, is my sanctuary, a place where order and peace are the reigning principles. The silence I've cultivated, however, wasn't always a choice. It grew to fill the space left by my son, Stefan. 3 years ago, the line between us, already frayed by a lifetime of misunderstandings, snapped entirely. Not a call, not a card, not a word when my dearest friend passed, nor when a winter storm knocked out my power for a week. The silence became a presence in itself, a guest who had overstayed its welcome, but refused to leave. And so, my 68th birthday began like any other Tuesday. The morning air was cool and smelled of damp earth and the sweet perfume of the late-blooming jasmine clinging to the trellis. I sat on the porch, a cup of Earl Grey tea warming my palms, watching the finches squabble over the feeder. The world felt contained, predictable, and safe within the borders of my small yard. It was in this state of gentle reverie that I heard it, a single, soft thud against the front door. Not the sharp rap of a delivery driver or the cheerful knock of a neighbor. Just the one sound, followed by the crunch of gravel as a car drove away. Curiosity, a gentle but persistent current, pulled me from my chair. On the slate step sat a parcel, elegantly wrapped in thick, cream-colored paper and tied with a simple silver ribbon. There was no shipping label, no postage, only my name written in a hand I would know anywhere. Annalise Meyer. Stefan's script was as it had always been, precise, architectural, each letter formed with an engineer's exactitude. For a long moment, I simply stood there, the warm stone beneath my bare feet, tracing the shape of his writing with my eyes. It felt like an artifact from a forgotten civilization, a relic of a relationship that now existed only in memory. I carried it inside and placed it on the polished surface of my oak dining table, the one my late husband, Klaus, had built for me. The package sat there, a silent, beautiful enigma. My tea had gone cold. I went to the kitchen to reheat it, my movements slow and deliberate, a way of postponing the inevitable. For 3 years, I had yearned for a sign, a bridge across the chasm of silence. Now that one had appeared, I was terrified to cross it. Finally, with a deep breath that did little to calm the fluttering in my chest, I untied the ribbon and carefully unfolded the paper. Inside was a simple white box. When I lifted the lid, the most wonderful aroma filled the air, lavender and butter and something sweet and floral. Nestled in layers of delicate tissue paper were 24 shortbread cookies. They were exquisite. Each was a perfect pale gold rectangle, flecked with tiny purple specks of lavender and adorned with a single, crystallized violet. I had never known Stefan to show the slightest interest in baking. His domain was one of straight lines and cold logic, not the alchemy of the kitchen. Taped to the inside of the lid was a small, cream-colored card, the same stock as the wrapping paper. In that same precise, blue-ink script, it read, "Happy birthday, Mother. A new beginning." I sank into a chair, holding the card as if it were a fragile bird's egg. A new beginning. The words were a balm and a barb, a promise of the very thing I had mourned the loss of. An ache, soft and familiar, settled in my throat. It was the ache of hope, a feeling so potent and so dangerous I had taught myself to live without it. I wanted to believe it. I wanted to pluck a cookie from its paper nest, to taste the sweetness and let it be a symbol of reconciliation. But a quiet, insistent voice in the back of my mind held me back. It wasn't suspicion, not yet. It was something closer to self-preservation. A lesson learned over decades of tiptoeing around Stefan's moods, of navigating his rigid expectations and baffling resentments. I had spent a lifetime making myself smaller to accommodate him, and in the quiet of the last 3 years, I had slowly, painstakingly, begun to reclaim that space. With a resolve that surprised me, I took a small, airtight container from the pantry. I selected one cookie, the one with the most perfect violet, and sealed it inside. The rest, I rewrapped with the same care Stefan had used, smoothing the paper, retying the ribbon until it looked untouched. My friend, Ingrid Hoffman, lived just down the road. She was Stefan's mother-in-law, a woman whose warmth and kindness had been a steady light in my life, especially after Stefan and I became estranged. Ingrid was a baker herself, a woman who understood that sweetness was a language all its own. Giving her the cookies felt right. It was an act of generosity, yes, but it was also an act of release. It was easier to give them away than to sit with them, to let their meaning and the questions they raised fester in the quiet of my home. That afternoon, as the sun began its descent, casting long, golden shadows across the lawn, I walked to Ingrid's house. Her wind chimes sang a gentle melody in the breeze. She met me at the door, her face crinkling into a warm smile, and tried to protest the gift. "Annalise, you shouldn't have," she said, her hands fluttering. "It's nothing," I assured her. "A little birthday surprise that's too much for one person." She took the box with a delighted little gasp, promising to have one with her evening tea. Walking home, I felt a strange sense of lightness. The package was no longer my burden to carry, my puzzle to solve. I glanced back at my own empty dining table and felt not loss, but a quiet, steadying relief. The single cookie sat in my refrigerator, a lone question mark in the cold, dim light. The next morning, the stillness was broken by the sharp ring of the telephone. I was at the counter, watching the steam curl from my freshly poured tea, and the sound made me jump. It was early still. As I reached for the phone, the screen lit up with a name I had not seen in 1,000 days. Stefan. My hand hovered, my breath caught in my throat. The phone buzzed again, insistent. On the third ring, I answered, my voice barely a whisper. "Hello. Hi, Mother." His voice was smooth, almost unnaturally casual, as if we had spoken just yesterday. It slid across the line, ignoring the 3-year gulf of silence that lay between us. "Happy birthday." "A little late, I know." I sank onto a kitchen stool, the porcelain of the teacup cool against my suddenly nerveless fingers. "Stefan. I got your package." "Yeah," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "I wasn't sure you would. Wasn't sure you'd open it, to be honest." "I did," I said. "It was a surprise." A beat of silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken things. Then, his voice still light, he asked, "So, how were they?" "The cookies?" "Yeah." I took a slow, deliberate breath, choosing my words with the care of a librarian shelving a rare book. "Oh, they were beautiful, Stefan. Truly. But I didn't have any myself." I gave the box to Ingrid. The silence that followed was absolute. It was so total, so empty, that I pulled the phone away from my ear to see if the call had disconnected. It hadn't. "You gave them to Ingrid." The warmth was gone from his voice. It was flat, cold, sharp as a shard of broken glass. "Yes," I said, a knot of confusion tightening in my stomach. "She adores lavender shortbread." And it was such a generous amount, I knew I couldn't possibly. "You did what?" The words were quiet, but they struck me with the force of a shout. I physically flinched, my knuckles white on the teacup. "Stefan, what is it? What's wrong?" "They weren't for her," he hissed, the casual facade utterly shattered. "They were for you. Only for you." His voice cracked on the last words, a strange, brittle sound that was not grief, but something else entirely. It was the sound of a meticulously constructed plan falling to pieces. I sat there, stunned into silence, the cooling tea forgotten in my hands. "I didn't know," I managed, my own voice small. "Right," he spat, the word dripping with a bitterness that felt ancient. "Of course, you didn't. You never do." And then he was gone. The dial tone hummed, a monotonous, empty sound in the sudden quiet of my kitchen. I placed the phone gently back in its cradle, my heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. "Only for you." The words echoed in the space he had vacated. I rose from the stool and walked to the refrigerator, my movements stiff and automatic. I opened the door. There it was. The small, sealed container. One perfect cookie, one crystallized violet, waiting. I stared at it, a cold dread seeping into my bones, a dread so profound it felt like a premonition. And then another phone began to ring. It was the old landline in the hallway, a relic I kept mostly for nostalgia's sake. Almost no one ever called it. A new wave of fear, sharp and specific, washed over me as I walked towards the sound. The receiver felt foreign in my hand, the line crackling with disuse. "Hello, Annalise." It was Lena, Stefan's wife. Her voice was thin and stretched taut with panic. "It's Ingrid. She's at the hospital." The floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. I leaned against the wall for support. What happened?" "She collapsed," Lena said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "This morning. She was vomiting. She was so dizzy and confused. I thought it was a terrible stomach flu, but then, she couldn't stand up. She didn't know where she was. The doctors in the ER, they don't know what it is. They're running every test they can think of." My mouth was as dry as dust. A single, terrible question formed in my mind. "Lena, did she eat anything unusual yesterday? Anything at all?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, filled with the faint, sterile sounds of a hospital. She mentioned cookies," Lena said finally, her voice hesitant. "Beautiful lavender ones. She said you brought them over." "I did," I whispered. "I gave her the box Stefan sent for my birthday." Another silence, longer this time. I could hear the frantic beating of my own heart in my ears. "Annalise," Lena asked, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Is it possible the cookies made her sick?" I swallowed against the lump in my throat. "I don't know," I said, the words feeling like a lie. "I didn't have any myself." "If you think of anything," she pleaded, "anything at all, please, you'll tell me?" "Yes," I promised. "Of course." We said our goodbyes, and I hung up the phone. I stood in the dim hallway, the afternoon light fading outside, casting the living room in a palette of gray and shadows. I didn't turn on a lamp. I didn't move. I simply stood there as the world I had so carefully constructed began to fracture around me. Later that night, unable to settle, I found myself in the kitchen, performing small, mindless tasks. Wiping down counters that were already clean. Refolding dish towels. It was a search for order in the midst of chaos. I opened the lid of the outdoor recycling bin to toss a stray bottle, and my eyes caught on something out of place. Tucked beneath a pile of newspapers was a small, amber glass vial, the kind used for essential oils or laboratory samples. There was no label, but as I picked it up, I could see a faint, powdery residue clinging to the inside. It wasn't mine. I had never seen it before. My hands began to shake. I went back inside, the vial cold in my palm. I opened the refrigerator. The cookie in its small plastic tomb seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. An object of beauty transformed into an object of terror. I carried the cookie and the vial into my study and set them on the old wooden desk, side by side under the warm glow of the reading lamp. The sugar on the crystallized violet sparkled. A gift and the vessel that may have poisoned it. Was it meant for me? The question was a physical weight in the room, suffocating and immense. My mind raced, connecting points of light in a constellation of darkness. Stefan's cold fury on the phone. They were for you. Only for you. His meticulous nature. His long-held, simmering resentments. Before I allowed myself to think further, to fall into the abyss of denial, I picked up the phone and called Dr. Benno Schmidt. He was a brilliant toxicologist at a private lab downtown, and years ago, as a bright, curious boy, he had been one of my most devoted library patrons. We had stayed in touch, a friendship built on a mutual respect for knowledge and precision. "Benno," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I need a favor. A quiet one." There was a pause. "Annalise. It's late. Is everything all right?" "I don't know," I answered honestly. "I need something tested. Urgently and discreetly." He didn't press for details, a kindness for which I was deeply grateful. "Bring it to the lab first thing in the morning. I'll meet you at the back entrance." I hung up and stood in the center of my quiet, familiar living room. But it was no longer familiar. It was a crime scene. I could feel Stefan's voice in the air around me, cold and sharp. "You did what?" That night, I did not sleep. The single cookie in its container was a sentinel in the refrigerator, guarding a truth I was terrified to learn. The lab was an unassuming brick building in a part of town I rarely visited. True to his word, Benno was waiting for me by a nondescript service door, his lab coat a stark white against the gray morning. His kind, intelligent eyes were full of concern. "Annalise," he said softly. "What's going on?" I couldn't bring myself to explain it all, not yet. I simply handed him the sealed container with the cookie and the small amber vial. He looked from the innocent-looking pastry to the vial, and a flicker of understanding crossed his face. "I see," he said, his voice grave. "I'll run a full-spectrum analysis. I'll call you as soon as I have anything." He hesitated for a moment. Is someone ill?" "Yes," I said, the word catching in my throat. "My son's mother-in-law, Ingrid Hoffman." He nodded, his expression hardening with professional focus. "I'll put a rush on it." As he disappeared back inside, I returned to my car, but I didn't start the engine. The quiet of the parking lot was filled with ghosts, memories of Stefan that I had long ago packed away. Stefan as a boy, meticulously organizing his colored pencils not by color, but by the precise length of their sharpened points. Stefan as a teenager, refusing to eat at a restaurant because the table salt was in a shaker and not a cellar. The time I'd accidentally bought the wrong brand of pasta, and he'd calmly, silently, thrown the entire cooked dinner in the trash, his face a mask of cold disappointment. I had called it sensitivity. I had called him particular. My husband, Klaus, had worried. "There's a hardness in him, Annalise," he'd said once, his voice heavy with a sadness I didn't want to acknowledge. A lack of grace for the imperfections of the world. I had defended him, smoothed over the incidents, made excuses. What I had called sensitivity, I now saw with terrifying clarity, was an ironclad rigidity, an absolute intolerance for any deviation from his own internal, unknowable script. A call from the hospital mid-morning confirmed that Ingrid's condition was unchanged. They were mystified. Her heart was behaving erratically, her neurological symptoms were confounding. I listened, my own heart a cold stone in my chest, and said nothing of the cookie. To voice the suspicion would be to make it real, to give it a power I was not yet ready to confront. I sat in my kitchen, the house unervingly silent, and waited. The phone rang just after 1 o'clock. It was Benno. "Annalise," he began, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. "I have the preliminary results." I held my breath. "It's in the cookie," he said, his voice tight. "And we found matching residue in the vial. It's digitalis, a potent cardiac glycoside, the kind derived from the foxglove plant." He paused. "It's not a subtle toxin, Annalise. In this concentration, it's not an accident. This was deliberate." The world tilted, and I gripped the edge of the counter to steady myself. My son, my Stefan. He had sent me poison, wrapped in a beautiful ribbon. A gift of death, disguised as a new beginning. And I, in an act of what I now saw as divine intervention, had passed it on. "The person who ate this," Benno continued gently, "they would need a specific antidote, and quickly. You need to call the hospital. You need to tell them to test for digitalis poisoning. And Annalise, you need to call the police." We hung up, and for a long time, I did not move. The afternoon sun streamed through the kitchen window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air oblivious. My son had tried to kill me. The thought was so monstrous, so unnatural, that my mind refused to fully grasp it. But the evidence was there, cold and clinical. The vial. The cookie. Ingrid, lying in a hospital bed. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I walked through my garden as dusk settled, touching the soft petals of the roses, the rough leaves of the sage. The world was still beautiful, but my perception of it had been irrevocably altered. It now held a darkness I had never imagined. My phone buzzed in my pocket. An unknown number. I almost let it go, but some instinct made me answer. "Is this Annalise Meyer?" The voice was calm, professional, and female. "Yes," I said, my throat tight. "My name is Detective Wagner. I'm with the Havenwood Police Department. I've just received a call from Dr. Benno Schmidt regarding a toxicology report he filed on your behalf." He said you had requested that any findings of a criminal nature be forwarded to us. Is that correct? The question hung in the cool evening air. This was the point of no return. To say yes was to set in motion a series of events that would destroy what was left of my family. To say no was to protect a monster. My voice, when I found it, was surprisingly steady. Yes, detective. That is correct. Would you be willing to come to the station to provide a statement and formally submit the evidence? I would. The meeting took place in a small, sterile office that smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. Detective Wagner was younger than I expected, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She was patient and methodical, her presence calming despite the grim circumstances. She asked me to start from the beginning. I recounted the last 3 years of silence, the arrival of the package, the architectural handwriting, the exquisite cookies. I told her about my strange hesitation, the instinct that had prompted me to save one and give the rest to Ingrid. I described the phone call with Stefan, his voice shifting from feigned warmth to cold fury. They were for you, I repeated his words. Only for you. I told her about Lena's panicked call from the hospital and, finally, about finding the amber vial in the recycling bin. She listened without interruption, her pen scratching quietly against a legal pad. Mrs. Meyer, she said when I had finished, her voice gentle but firm. Do you believe your son, Stefan Meyer, intended to poison you? I looked down at my hands, which were twisting a tissue into a shredded mess in my lap. I believe he sent a box of cookies containing a potent toxin to my home on my birthday, I said, choosing my words with care. He became enraged when he learned I had given them to someone else. His mother-in-law is now critically ill. I don't know what to believe about his intentions, detective. I only know the facts. She nodded slowly, her gaze unwavering. We have enough to proceed. The lab report, Ingrid Hoffman's medical status, your testimony. We'll get a warrant to search his home and his digital devices. As I left the police station, the sky had bruised to a deep purple. I sat in my car for a long time, the keys cold in my hand. A profound, hollow sadness washed over me. It was not guilt. It was the grief of a mother realizing the child she had raised, the boy whose small hand she had once held, was a stranger capable of unimaginable cruelty. And in that moment, a new feeling began to surface, pushing through the grief and fear, a cold, clear anger. He had not only tried to take my life, he had tried to do it in a way that would leave me utterly bewildered, making me a participant in my own demise. He had underestimated me. He had counted on me being the same woman who had always placated him, always smoothed things over. He was wrong. That night, for the first time in 3 days, I slept, if only for a few hours. When I woke, the anger had solidified into resolve. I knew what I had to do. I called him the next morning. Stefan, I said, my voice intentionally light. I was so worried after our call. I'm on my way into town. I thought I might stop by for a moment, just to see how you and Lena are holding up. There was a brief pause. Of course, Mother, he said, his tone once again smooth and controlled. That would be fine. Before I left my house, I activated the voice recorder app on my phone and slipped it into my coat pocket. Stefan opened the door to his pristine, minimalist house, a place of glass and steel and polished concrete. It was as beautiful and as cold as he was. Mother, he said with a tight smile. Come in. I won't stay long, I said, stepping inside. I just wanted to see how Lena is. And to apologize if I was abrupt about the cookies. He waved a dismissive hand. It's forgotten. Lena is at the hospital with her mother. They're still not sure what it is. Some aggressive, unidentified virus, they think. I nodded, feigning sympathy. How awful. Well, Ingrid is a strong woman. I let my gaze wander around the immaculate kitchen. And you know, she was so taken with your baking. She said the one with the crystallized violet on top was almost too beautiful to eat. I watched him. It was a gamble, a shot in the dark. I had never spoken to Ingrid after she'd eaten the cookies. I had no idea which one she'd chosen. He was standing by the sink, and for a fraction of a second, he froze. A tiny, almost imperceptible tightening of the muscles in his jaw. He turned, a faint, condescending smile on his lips. "She always did have an eye for the aesthetic," he said smoothly. "The violets were the most difficult to place. They required a steady hand." And there it was. The fatal slip. The quiet confession wrapped in arrogance. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I kept my face a mask of placid concern. "Well, your talents are endless," I said, my voice betraying none of the turmoil inside me. I gathered my purse. "I should let you go. I'm sure you have things to do." As I turned to leave, my eyes swept the counter one last time. Partially hidden behind a canister of artisanal coffee beans was another small, amber vial, identical to the one I had found in my recycling. He saw me look. He took a half step, a subtle movement to block my line of sight. "Give my love to Lena," I said, walking to the door. "I will," he replied, his composure perfect. "Drive safely, mother." I didn't breathe until I was back in my car, the doors locked, the engine humming. My hands were trembling so violently I could barely grip the steering wheel. I pulled my phone from my pocket, stopped the recording, and with a few taps, emailed the audio file directly to Detective Wagner's official address. The subject line was simple: proof. Then I drove not home, but to the hospital. I found Lena in the waiting room, her face pale and drawn. I sat beside her, took her hand, and in a quiet, steady voice, I told her everything. The arrest happened later that day. It was quiet, efficient, and devoid of drama. Detective Wagner called to inform me. They had found the second vial, digital records of him purchasing bulk amounts of foxglove seeds, and detailed notes on extraction and dosage in encrypted files on his computer. The audio recording had been the final, undeniable piece of the puzzle. Ingrid began to recover slowly. The doctors, armed with the knowledge of digitalis poisoning, were able to administer the correct treatment. When she was finally lucid, I sat by her bedside. We didn't speak of Stefan. I simply held her hand. "I'm so sorry, Ingrid," I whispered. She squeezed my hand weakly, her eyes full of a deep, weary understanding. It was all that needed to be said. Lena, in the weeks that followed, wept in my kitchen. She spoke of Stefan's increasing distance, his secretiveness, the hours spent in his study with books on botany and chemistry she'd assumed were for his architectural landscaping projects. She had been living with a stranger, a man whose quiet resentments had festered into a darkness she could never have fathomed. Months have passed. The autumn leaves have fallen, and the first frost has silvered the grass in my garden. Stefan's trial is pending. His guilt is a foregone conclusion. The newspapers called it the birthday cookie case, a sensationalist moniker for a tragedy born of quiet, domestic poison. This morning, I went to the hall closet and took down an old, cedar-lined box where I used to keep archival supplies from my library days. I opened the refrigerator and took out the small plastic container. The cookie was still there, the lavender faded, the violet a dull shadow of its former beauty. Detective Wagner had returned it to me, sealed in an evidence bag. "A reminder," she'd said, "of what you survived." I placed the sealed bag inside the cedar box. Beside it, I placed the small, elegant card. "Happy birthday, Mother." A new beginning. It was a new beginning, just not the one he had planned. It was mine. I closed the lid and placed the box on the highest shelf in my study. It is not a trophy. It is a testament. A lesson in trusting the quiet, insistent voice of intuition. A memorial to the boundary I finally drew, not in anger, but in profound and necessary self-respect. I stand in my kitchen now, the familiar weight of my teacup in my hands. The house is quiet, but it is a different kind of quiet. It is not the silence of absence and estrangement, but the silence of peace. I have looked into the heart of a darkness I did not create but was forced to confront. I have survived. And in that survival, I have found not a hardening of my own heart, but a deeper, more resilient understanding of its strength. The world is still beautiful, and I am still here to see it.